The desert had a way of swallowing things whole. Sergeant Matrock Kessler had lived in the high desert long enough to know that the way it took sounds and flattened them, the way it took color and bleached it, the way it took people and made them either smaller or harder, and never anything in between. She'd gone hard. Most people who worked the Thornfield Research Station did. You had to out here, where the wind came off the flats carrying grit fine enough to work into the seams of your eyes, where the nearest town was 40 kilometers of cracked blacktop away, and where the work they did was too classified for most of the people doing it to talk about at dinner. She was running perimeter checks when the call came in. It was something she did every morning at 0600 and every evening at 1800, a habit from her early postings that she had never managed to stop even when the threat environment didn't technically warrant it. The Thornfield station was not a combat installation. It was a research facility, technically civilian, though the people who funded it and the people who secured it wore the same uniform. And the greatest operational risk was usually the wind, which came off the flats in the afternoons with enough force to get into equipment seals and raise hell. The alien ships on the north horizon changed the calculus somewhat, but they had been there for 8 months, and they had not done anything threatening, and Mara had reached the professional equilibrium of someone who has assessed a risk, determined it is real but non-immediate, and continues to watch it closely without letting it consume her. She was at the eastern corner of the perimeter fence, running her flashlight along the ground anchors, when Dmitri came jogging across the hardpan toward her, with his tablet pressed flat against his chest the way he did when he was scared, which in her experience was almost never. Dmitri Sokolov was 26 years old and had a PhD in remote sensing and a complete inability to conceal his emotional state from anyone paying attention, which Mara always was. He had been scared twice in the 8 months she'd known him. Once when a sandstorm took out the secondary relay array, and once when one of the Vorith had drifted within 30 meters of the main building without warning. Both times the tablet had come up against his chest like a shield. Both times the fear had been warranted. "They've got Kip," he said. She stopped walking. The wind moved around her. "Say that again." "The Vorith. They took Kip 22 minutes ago, right out of the eastern pen." Kip was the station mouse. Specifically, Kip was the test subject for Project Slingshot, a white mouse 3 years old, implanted with biological monitors and a microtransmitter the size of a grain of rice, trained to sit still inside a pressurized capsule no bigger than a coffee canister. The Vorith had apparently watched them long enough to understand what the capsule was for, long enough to want the creature inside it. Mara stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "Get Okafor, get Vasquez, and find me Dr. Chen." She did not say anything about how she felt, because the feeling that moved through her in that moment was not something that translated easily into words. It was the feeling of watching something small and helpless get swallowed by the desert, and knowing you were the only one standing between it and the nothing. The Vorith had arrived 8 months ago. That was the official number, 8 months. Though the xenolinguistics team believed they had been in orbit considerably longer, watching, cataloging, building the kind of patient, systematic understanding of a species that implied either vast intelligence or vast patience, and probably both. They came down in 4 ships, smooth-hulled and the color of old bone, and they settled themselves in the desert 40 kilometers north of Thornfield with the precision that suggested they had selected the location long before they landed. No weapons, no aggression. They stood on the hardpan and waited, and humanity, after approximately 3 weeks of collective panic, sent representatives to talk to them. The Vorith were tall. That was the first thing everyone noticed and could not stop noticing. They stood 2.5 meters, maybe 3 on the older ones, and they were built like something that had evolved for patience. Long limbs, low center of gravity, eyes that were wide and pale and moved in independent directions the way a bird's did. They had 4 fingers on each of their 6 hands. Their skin was a deep gray brown that shifted subtly in different light, not quite iridescent but close. They smelled faintly of copper and something herbal, like sage left out in the sun too long. They communicated through a combination of subsonic pulse and surface pattern change on their skin, a language that took humanity's best linguists 4 months to begin to understand, and which the Vorith apparently found endlessly amusing to watch humans attempt. The translation matrices were good but imperfect, prone to collapsing metaphors in ways that were sometimes funny and sometimes deeply unsettling. The first time Vasquez had tried to explain of a deadline, the translation had come back as something that meant, Approximately, the wall that kills you if you touch it. And the Vorith had stared at him with their pale, independently moving eyes for so long afterward that he'd had to go sit down. What the Vorith wanted, as far as anyone could determine, was an accounting of Earth's capabilities. Scientific, military, exploratory. They were not aggressive about this. They asked questions through their translators the way a professor might quiz a student, with an underlying assumption that the answers would be insufficient, and a patient willingness to wait for improvement. Mara had her own theory about what they were really doing, which she had shared with nobody, because it was not the kind of theory that survived contact with a conference room. Her theory was that the Vorith weren't assessing Earth's capabilities at all. They had been in orbit long enough to do that before they ever came down. What they were assessing was Earth's character. The capabilities were easy. You could read them from orbital scans, from broadcast signals, from the electromagnetic signature of a civilization that had been leaking its thoughts into space for a century. Character was harder. Character required proximity. She had not shared this theory with anyone, partly because it was not the kind of thing a sergeant said in debrief, and partly because if she was right, she had no idea what the Vorith were concluding, and that uncertainty sat at the back of her mind like a stone in a boot. They had been watching Project Slingshot for 6 months. Mara knew this because Dr. Chen had told her 3 weeks ago that the Vorith observers positioned near the eastern perimeter had been running some kind of spectral analysis on the launch pad. She had recommended they halt the project. Chen had said the Vorith had been explicitly invited to observe humanity's scientific programs as part of the diplomatic framework, and that stopping would be a provocation. Mara had written a security assessment recommending again that they halt the project or at minimum move the test animals. The assessment had been filed, nothing had changed. Now Kip was Dr. Yuki Chen was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular quality of stillness that came from decades of working in spaces where panic was professionally inadvisable. She had designed Project Slingshot. She had also, over the past 3 years, become quite attached to Kip, in the way that scientists who worked with animals sometimes did and never admitted anyone. A fact Mara had observed but never mentioned, because some things were not her business. She was looking at the eastern pen when Mara found her. The hatch was open. The capsule cradle was empty. There were no tracks. The Vorith didn't leave tracks the way humans did, their foot structure distributing weight across a wide pad that barely compressed the ground. The transmitter, Mara said.
Is it still broadcasting?
Yes. Chen's voice was very controlled. He's alive. Signals consistent with normal vital signs. Slightly elevated heart rate, which would be expected. Where their primary ship? Mara looked north. The Vorith ship was visible from here on clear days. A long, pale shape sitting on the flats, unchanged in 8 months. We need to get him back. We need to be extremely careful, Chen said. Taking something from them, even retrieving something of ours. They came here, to our station, and took a living thing. Mara kept her voice level. I'm not suggesting we go in shooting. I'm suggesting we go get our mouse. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said he will be frightened. It was such a simple thing to say. Such a human thing to worry about. Mara felt something tighten in her chest. Not grief exactly, not yet, but the cousin of it, the thing that lives next door. Yeah, she said. I know. The walk to the Vorith ship took 40 minutes. Mara went with Vasquez and Okafor and Dr. Chen, and she left the rest of her team at the station, with strict orders about what constituted a provocation and what did not. The desert was hot and bright and completely indifferent to all of them. A hawk turned slow circles overhead, riding something thermal and invisible. Nobody talked much on the walk. That was fine. Mara had served with Vasquez and Okafor long enough that their silences had different textures. And this one was the texture of people who were thinking hard about the same thing but from different angles. Okafor was thinking about sightlines. She could tell by the way his eyes moved, cataloging, habitual, not because there was threat but because he didn't know how to switch it off. Vasquez was thinking about the transmitter's signal, she suspected, running the numbers on battery life and range, and what it meant that it was still broadcasting clean. Chen was thinking about Kip. Mara was thinking about the word cowardice. She had been thinking about it since Dmitri said the Vorith had taken him, and it kept circling back. The Vorith had been watching Project Slingshot for 6 months. They had watched humans put a small animal in a small capsule and run rehearsals and drills and abort procedures. They had watched with their wide, independently moving eyes and reached some conclusion that had apparently required physical verification. The conclusion had something to do with cowardice, or the fear of cowardice, or the possibility of its opposite. She was not sure yet which. What she was sure of was that whatever the Vorith were trying to understand about humanity, they had decided that a mouse in a capsule was the place to look for it, and that either they were very wrong about humanity, or they were right in a way that made Mara uncomfortable and proud in equal measure. The Vorith were waiting for them. 3 of them stood outside the ship's primary entrance, a seamless oval that opened in the hull without any visible mechanism, just opened, smooth and complete like a mouth. They were the ones who handled diplomatic contact. Mara had names for them that were not their real names, because their real names were subsonic and made her molars ache. She called them Tall, Taller, and the Old One, which she felt was adequate. Tall raised 2 of its 6 hands, which was the gesture that meant something approximately like acknowledgement, or I see you. The translation matrix was ambiguous. Mara raised 1 hand back. She had gotten used to this. You have something of ours, she said. The Old One's skin shifted through a pattern Mara didn't recognize. A moment later, the translator on Chen's equipment rendered it. We have borrowed the small astronaut for study. It is unharmed. Mara parsed that phrase. The small astronaut. She let it sit for a moment without reacting to it because reacting was not useful. It's not an astronaut. It's a test subject. An animal. It belongs to us and we'd like it back. Another skin pattern. Another delay. The small astronaut was placed inside a pressurized capsule designed for atmospheric exit. It was to be launched into the upper atmosphere. This is your intent, to send it beyond the air. Is this not what your species calls an astronaut? One who travels among stars. Chen spoke quietly into her earpiece. They're not wrong. Mara was aware of that. She was also aware that this was exactly the kind of semantic argument that could swallow hours of time while a small white mouse sat alone and frightened in an alien ship. And she did not have the patience for it today. We want him back, she said. Now. Please. The 3 Vorith conferred in a way that was entirely internal, just the pattern shift on their skin, rippling between them, too fast and complex for the translator to catch more than fragments. What came through was insufficient demonstration. Not yet ready, waiting, Taller stepped forward. Its skin settled into the slow, deliberate pattern that meant it was about to say something it considered important. The translator worked for a long moment and then produced. Your species has stated that it intends to travel among the stars. We have observed your preparations. We observe that you practice by sending small things first, things of little value to you, to die in your place. We came to understand whether this is wisdom or cowardice. The desert was very quiet. Mara thought about Kip, 3 years old, white-furred, trained to sit still, living in a pen at the edge of a desert launch site. And she thought about the word cowardice. And she thought about the 12-year-old version of herself, watching a documentary about Laika, and feeling something crack open in her chest that had never quite healed back together. He's not of little value, she said. The Old One's skin shifted. You send it to die. We send it to come back. That's the whole point of the project. We build the capsule. We test it. We recover the subject safely. We're not throwing things away. We're making sure it's safe before anyone goes up. A long pause. The translation matrix hummed. You are making it safe, Tall said slowly. For others, yes. The small one goes first so that larger ones may follow without dying. That's roughly correct. The Old One's skin did something complex and slow. The translator produced a single word. Explain. What followed was 4 hours that Mara would later describe to the debriefers as the strangest diplomatic conversation she had ever had, which was saying something given that she had once helped negotiate a trade dispute between 2 mining consortiums on opposite sides of a collapsing communications satellite. She sat on the hardpan in the desert sun and explained Project Slingshot to 3 aliens, from the beginning as completely and honestly as she could. She explained the biometric monitors and what each one measured. She explained the capsule's pressure systems and the ablative heat shielding and the drogue chutes and the recovery beacon. She explained that Kip had been selected not because he was expendable, but because the physical demands of the mission, the G-forces at launch, the pressure fluctuations, the cosmic radiation exposure, were not fully modeled, and a living subject could tell them things no simulation could. The Vorith questions. They always had questions, but today the questions were different, more specific, more interested, less like assessment, and more like genuine curiosity. They asked about the recovery beacon in particular. How long could it broadcast? What happened if the capsule landed in water? What happened if it landed in terrain where the recovery vehicle couldn't reach? They were asking, Mara realized, about contingencies, about the things that could go wrong and what had been planned for them. You have planned for many failures, Tall observed. Yes, this is unusual. A pause for translation. Most species who send things upward plan for success. Planning for failure is how you get success, Mara said. You build the failure modes into the design and you design around them. You don't ignore them and hope. The pattern ripple moved between the three of them, fast and complex. When it settled, the Old One spoke. Your species has things upward before. We have records of earlier broadcasts. Some did not return. Some didn't, Mara said. Those failures are why we do this. So fewer things don't come back. The small astronaut is a response to earlier loss, Taller said slowly. Yes, Mara paused. She thought about whether to say what she was thinking and to say it anyway. Because 4 hours into a conversation with beings who could read body speech, there was not much point in withholding. Every safety system in that capsule exists because something somewhere failed without it. It's not abstract. Someone built the heat shielding and remembered a specific thing that burned. Someone's designed the abort system and remembered a specific moment when there wasn't one. The failures are in there. In the design. We didn't forget them. The desert wind moved. The translation matrix hummed. The Old One's skin moved through a slow pattern that Dmitri later told her was not in any of their reference records. Too specific, too calibrated to this exact moment to map cleanly to any prior usage. He cannot speak to tell you these things, Taller observed. His body tells us. Heart rate, blood pressure, cortisol levels, neural activity. He doesn't need to use words. We know how to listen. The Old One was very still for a long time. Then, your species cannot hear the body speech of your own kind without instruments. Mara glanced at Chen, who shrugged. Not precisely, no, we can hear a lot. Tone of voice, facial expression, but not the interior signals, not accurately. The three Vorath did their internal conference pattern again. It went on longer this time. The sun moved. A dry wind came off the flats and moved Mara's hair across her face, and she didn't touch it. We can hear body speech, Tall said finally. Of most species we have encountered. That's useful, Mara said carefully. We heard the small astronaut. A pause. The pattern on Tall's skin was slow and careful, like someone choosing words. It is not afraid. It is oriented, calm, expecting something. The elevated pulse is not fear. It is readiness. Mara felt something shift in her chest. She looked at Chen, who had gone very still. He was trained, Chen said, voice tight but controlled. For months, launch procedure capsule, countdown. He knows the sequence. He is waiting for the launch, Tall said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Yeah, Mara said finally. He is. They brought Kip out 40 minutes later. One of the younger Vorath, one Mara hadn't named yet because she hadn't interacted with it before, carried the capsule cradle in 2 of its 6 hands with an exaggerated carefulness that Mara recognized, despite everything, as the behavior of someone who had been told to be gentle with something fragile and was trying very hard. It set the cradle down on the hardpan in front of Chen, with what Mara could only describe as deliberateness. Kip was inside the capsule, sitting in his harness. He turned his head and looked at Chen through the porthole. Chen made a small sound that she would probably deny later. Your preparation is more complete than we estimated, the Old One said. We apologize for the removal without consent. It was, a long-prolonged pause for translation, curiosity improperly applied. Mara accepted the apology with a nod because she was a professional. She was also watching Chen unhook the capsule from the cradle and hold it carefully with both hands. And she was watching Kip press his nose against the porthole. And she was thinking about how the Vorath had just told her that a 3-year-old mouse was sitting calm and oriented and waiting for his launch. And something was working its way through her that was not quite pride but was close enough to it that the words seemed useful. Can I ask you something? She said to the Old One. His pattern shifted. Assent. What were you actually looking for? When you took him, what were you trying to understand? The Old One was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Mara thought maybe she'd pushed too far, asked a question that didn't translate, stepped on some invisible cultural wire. Then the pattern shifted, slow and deliberate, and the translator worked, and what it produced was, we wanted to know if you were the kind of species that sends things it loves into the dark. The desert was very quiet. Yes, Mara said. We know this now. A pause. We are also this kind. It is rarer than expected. The launch happened 6 days later, right on schedule. Mara stood at the observation point with Chen and Vasquez and Okafor, and she watched the countdown board, and she felt the subsonic thrum of the ignition sequence through the soles of her boots on the hardpan. The capsule was mounted on the test vehicle, a slender thing unimpressive by most standards, a local atmospheric rocket carrying a 2-kilogram payload, and it sat on the pad looking clean in the early morning light. She had been at rocket launches before. Not many. This wasn't her usual field. But enough to know how they felt. The long, specific tension of the countdown, the way the last 30 seconds had a different quality than the 30 before them. The way the sound and light disconnected briefly at ignition, and for a fraction of a second you saw it before you heard it, and in that fraction of a second the universe felt very large and quiet. She had stood at bigger pads with bigger vehicles and felt the same thing. The size didn't actually change it. The core of it was always the same. Something was going up. Something made with human hands, full of human intention, was about to cross the boundary where air became something else. And what happened there had been planned for by people who would never see it with their own eyes. She had always found that fact moving in a way she couldn't fully explain. She still did. The Vorith were there. All of them. Not just the diplomatic 3, but what appeared to be the entire crew of all 4 ships, standing in a loose arrangement to the north of the observation point, watching. No translator. No formal request to be present, they had simply come. Mara had looked at them when she arrived and made a decision not to ask, because the answer would take 4 hours and the launch was in 20 minutes. She did notice, as the countdown entered its final 2 minutes, that the Vorith had gone still. Not the small constant movements that characterize their usual presence, the adjustments, the rippling skin patterns, the subtle shifting of their long frames, but genuinely still, in the way that something is still when it is paying close attention. All of those wide, pale eyes, all of them independently capable of looking in different directions, turned toward the launch pad. The countdown went. She watched it the way she always did. Not on the board, but on Chen, who was the best instrument she had for understanding what was actually happening. Chen was still. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her face was very composed. At T-minus 30 seconds, Chen's hands tightened. The rocket went up on a column of fire and white smoke, exactly as it was supposed to. It was fast, faster than you expected, even when you knew it was coming, and the sound arrived a half-second behind the light and hit Mara in the chest like a fist, and then faded away into the desert, into the wide, empty sky. The telemetry board updated. Mara watched the numbers. Heart rate, blood pressure, altitude, velocity, capsule integrity, everything was where it was supposed to be. Everything was functioning. The little transmitter was singing. Chen's hands unclenched. 4 minutes and 17 seconds after launch, the drogue chutes deployed. 4 minutes and 41 seconds, the main canopy opened, a bright orange flower against the pale desert sky. The recovery team was already moving, quad bikes trailing dust across the hardpan, cutting toward the projected landing site 3 kilometers east. Mara watched Chen track it on her tablet. Watched her face. At 6 minutes and 3 seconds, the recovery team came on the radio. "We have the capsule. Package intact." Chen closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them and turned to write a note in her field log, because she was a scientist, and there were things to record, and that was what she did. Mara had always admired that about her, the way she channeled everything through the discipline of recording, as if the act of writing it down was itself a form of care, a way of saying, "This happened, this mattered, I will not let it pass unwitnessed." Mara turned to look at the Vorith. She wasn't sure what she expected, some kind of reaction, some alien version of applause or acknowledgement or indifference. What she saw was harder to name. They were all very still, which was unusual. The Vorith moved constantly, small shifts and adjustments and patterns. But they were still now, all of them, watching the orange canopy descend. The old one's skin was doing the slow, deliberate pattern that meant something important. She'd seen it before, but never quite like this. Not this sustain, not this. She didn't have a word for it. "What does that pattern mean?" she asked Dmitri quietly, who had the translation matrix on his tablet, the long, slow one. He looked. He frowned at the screen. "It's not a perfect match. Closest the matrix can get is," he hesitated, "recognition. Or witnessing. Like, the act of being present for something that matters." Mara looked back at the old one. The old one's skin shifted once more, one slow deliberate ripple, and then went still. She understood. She had no idea why she understood. Maybe because she'd been standing in this desert for 8 months with these strange, patient, six-handed things, and had started to learn the difference between their silences. But she understood. They were paying attention. The way you paid attention to something you had decided mattered. The debrief was long. It was always long. There were people from 7 different agencies in the room, and they all had questions. And Mara answered them as completely as she could, which was more completely than she was comfortable with, because some things felt like they should stay in the desert. The primary question, the one that everyone came back to, circled, asked from different angles, was whether the Vorith's behavior indicated hostile intent or surveillance or territorial testing or something else. Mara told them what she thought, which was none of the above. She told them about the translation, the small astronaut, and the question about cowardice, and the moment when Tal had said he is waiting for the launch, and the hours of explanation on the hardpan. She told them about the Vorith coming to watch the launch without being invited, and about the pattern that meant witnessing. What they were doing, she said, was deciding something about us. I don't know exactly what, but I think they were trying to figure out what kind of species we are. And what did they decide? Someone asked. Mara thought about that for a moment. She thought about Kip in the capsule, oriented and calm, waiting for the thing he'd been trained for. She thought about Chen's hands unclenching. She thought about the old one watching the orange parachute come down. I think they decided we were worth watching more carefully, she said. The room was quiet for a moment. Is that good? Someone asked. I don't know yet, Mara said honestly, but I think it's better than the alternative. 3 weeks after the launch, the Vorith asked for a formal meeting. Not a diplomatic session, they had a word for those, and they used a different word for this. The translation matrix rendered the difference as approximately the gap between a hearing and a conversation, which Mara found encouraging. She went with Chen and 2 linguists. The old one was there, and tall, and a third one she hadn't seen at diplomatic sessions before. Older, she thought, or at least more physically weathered, the skin a deeper gray with faint striations she hadn't seen on the others. She called this one the astronomer because of the way it had been watching the sky every night from the north perimeter of its ship, turning those wide, pale eyes up and moving them in slow, systematic sweeps. The astronomer spoke first. The translation came through broken, which meant either the vocabulary was outside the matrix's range, or the concept was. And Mara had learned to treat both as equally important. What came through was, "You're small astronaut," it returned. "Yes," Chen said. "He did. Your species sends things into the dark, expecting them to return." A pause. "You build the return into the design. You do not release and hope." "No," Chen said. "The recovery system is as important as the launch system. More, in some ways." The astronomer's skin moved through a pattern the translator couldn't catch, and then settled into something slow. "We have traveled," it said. Mara could see Dimitri's face tightening over the matrix, working to keep up, for a very long time. "We have encountered many species who reach for the stars. Most of them," a long pause, the matrix working, "throw things outward. They do not build the return." The room was quiet. "We built the return for a mouse," Chen said quietly, almost to herself. "Yes." The astronomer's skin did the witnessing pattern. "This is what we came to understand." One of the linguists, a young woman named Peralta, who had been with the xenolinguistics team since the beginning, leaned forward slightly. "Can you tell us more about what you've observed? In other species?" Mara noticed that Tal's attention shifted toward Peralta in a way that felt, to Mara's hard-won intuition, like something between surprise and approval. The Vorith apparently hadn't expected that question from that direction. The astronomer considered for a long time, long enough that Mara was fairly sure it was choosing its words with real care. Not just waiting for translation. "We have encountered species that were very capable," it said at last. "Fast learners. Technically advanced. They built ships. They traveled. Some of them are still traveling. They do not reach out to others. They did not learn to build the return when the return was inconvenient." Another pause. "They did not learn because they stopped valuing the small things early. The small things were convenient until they were not. Then the small things were left." A final pause, longer. "Species that leave their small things tend to leave everything, eventually, including each other." Nobody spoke. "You kept the small astronaut," the astronomer said. "After the test, you did not need it further, you kept it." Chen's voice was very even. He wasn't a tool. He was part of the project, part of the team. "Yes," the witnessing pattern again, slow and sustained. "We know this. This is what we came to understand. What came after would take years to fully understand and longer still to explain to anyone outside that conference room." The Vorith weren't offering an alliance. They didn't operate by alliances, the way they explained it. Their whole social architecture was different. The concept didn't quite map. What they were offering was something the translation matrix eventually rendered as accompaniment, or possibly alongsideness. And what it meant in practice was that they would share navigational data for the regions of space they had traveled, and allow human vessels to operate in those regions, and give warning of hazards, and receive the same in return. It wasn't protection, it wasn't a treaty, it was something quieter and, Mara thought, more durable. In the debrief afterward, Chen was asked what she believed had changed the Vorath's assessment. She was precise and careful in her answer, as she always was. But at the end, she said something that Mara had not expected and could not stop thinking about later. I think they had seen a great many species decide that small things were expendable. I think they had been making that same calculation themselves for a very long time, and they had come to believe it was simply what intelligence did when it scaled up. Discard the small, the vulnerable, the things that couldn't speak for themselves. I think they were surprised to find that we hadn't, and I think surprise, for a species that old, is rare enough to matter. Mara caught up with Chen in the corridor outside the debrief room, where Chen had stopped and was standing against the wall with her arms crossed and her eyes somewhere on the middle distance. "You did good in there," Mara said. "I said what was true. That's what I meant." Chen was quiet for a moment, then the astronomer said something I keep turning over, about species that leave their small things, that they tend to leave everything eventually. "Yeah? I don't think it was only an observation." Chen looked at her. "I think it was the test. Not Project Slingshot, Kip in retirement. Whether we kept him after we didn't need him anymore. Whether the care continued after the utility ended." Mara thought about that. When did they start watching the retirement pen? 6 weeks after the launch, based on the spectral analysis records. They stood there for a moment in the corridor. "It passed," Mara said. "Yes," Chen said. "It did." And she uncrossed her arms and walked down the corridor toward her office, where a 3-year-old mouse was waiting in an enclosure with a wheel and a nesting box and an apple on Thursdays. Mara thought about that on the drive back across the desert. The sun was low, cutting hard shadows across the flats, and the light was the color of old copper, and the Vorath ships on the horizon caught it and held it the way bone holds warmth. Slowly, reluctantly, longer than you'd expect. She thought about Kip in his capsule, pressing his nose against the porthole. She thought about a 12-year-old girl watching a documentary and feeling something crack open in her chest. She thought about the old one's skin doing the witnessing pattern while an orange parachute came down out of the desert sky. "We build the return into the design." She pulled over on the side of the road and got out and stood for a minute in the failing light, just breathing the dry air. It smelled like sage and warm dust, and something faintly metallic, the way the desert always did in the evening. A hawk turned one final slow circle overhead, riding the last of the thermals, and then folded and dropped and was gone. She got back in the truck. Kip lived for another 2 years after the launch, which was a long time for a mouse. And Mara thought Chen was probably responsible for some of that. He was retired from the project after the successful test. She had pushed hard for that, and won. And he spent his remaining time in a large enclosure in Chen's office, with a wheel and a nesting box and a piece of apple every Thursday, because that was what he liked. He never launched again. He didn't need to. He'd done his job. His biometric data from the flight was incorporated into the design specifications for every crew capsule that followed. The thermal tolerances, the pressure curves, the radiation shielding parameters. His elevated but calm heart rate at launch became a reference benchmark. Crew candidates were evaluated partly by how closely their physiological response to launch stress matched his. Nobody put this in the official project documentation exactly, but everyone who worked on the program knew. There was a small notation in the engineering appendix of the crew capsule specification. A reference number that, if you looked it up, pointed back to the biometric data from the Slingshot test flight. The margins of acceptable variance for crew physiological response during launch were bracketed by Kip's readings, one standard deviation either side. Engineers who were new sometimes asked why a mouse's heart rate was in the spec. The answer was always the same: because we promised him the flight data would be used. Nobody could quite explain why that answer never got a follow-up question. The small astronaut had gone first, so the larger ones could follow. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. But it turned out the plan had done something else too. Something nobody had designed for, had not modeled or calculated or predicted. It had been witnessed. By something old and patient and vastly far from home, something that had traveled long enough to have lost count of the species it had watched reach for the sky, and fail or succeed or simply stop reaching. It had been seen, and in the seeing, it had become something other than just a test. It had become the first sentence of a longer conversations between two kinds of life that had, against considerable odds, both decided that small things deserved the effort of bringing them home. Mara retired from Thornfield 6 years after the launch. She got a commendation she didn't frame and a party she didn't particularly enjoy, and she drove back across the desert on a clear October evening, with the windows down and the flats stretching away on both sides into the dark. The Vorith ships were gone. They'd been gone for 11 months off, with 3 human vessels on a navigational survey of the outer system. She'd gotten used to the absence the way you got used to any absence, slowly, unevenly, with occasional sharp reminders. She stopped at the pullout where she'd stopped 6 years before, the night of the conversation, and got out and looked at the sky. It was extraordinarily clear. The stars were dense and close, the way they got out here away from light, the way they never got in cities. Somewhere out there, a vessel built with tolerances informed by small white mouse was making its way through the dark with a crew of 7 human beings who were going to come home. The return was built into the design. She stood there for a while, long enough to get cold. Long enough for the hawk, or a different hawk, they didn't live that long, to stop circling and go wherever hawks went at night. Then she got back in the truck and drove west toward the lights of town, small and bright against the enormous dark, and did not look back. She didn't need to. She already knew what was there.